people.
Whoa.
It was pretty awesome.
Goodness.
It was pretty awesome.
Did you go to any UNESCO sites?
Yes, we went to the windmills, and is it?
So they were open as well.
Yeah, the couple.
Good.
They had another one. We didn't go on that tour that was open. There isn't the mikveh and the Jewish community ruin UNESCO or no?
Which one?
Inspire the mikveh and
I don't know if that's a UNESCO's. I don't think it is.
I don't think it's UNESCO yet.
I don't think, I don't know that there's any Jewish sites in Spire, Worms, or mine. Did you went to Spire or
Just Spire.
Yeah. So the heartland, that's the heartland of Ashkenaz. That's where the Ashkenaz, when we talk about Ashkenazi Jews, our origins 1,000 years ago, not 2,000 years ago, or even 1,500 years ago, but for about 300 years, the center of Jewish culture was that part of Germany on the border with France and Germany, in the area that Judith was on the Rhine and I guess Neckar rivers. But the cities of Worms, Mainz, and Speyer, what we call Schum, actually. Schum.
Garlic.
Cities is garlic, exactly. Those were the heartland of Ashkenaz. It's where Yiddish developed, and it's where then when the Jews spread out and started going to Poland and moving east, they took that culture with them. But that was where it essentially grew. And so it's
I'll also tell you the guide we had for that part of Spire was not Jewish and very well trained and knowledgeable. Sometimes guides make stuff up. I had no quarrel with any of her comments and descriptions. It was really good.
Yeah. Well, I found that there's a lot of Germans that take a lot of pride in their Jewish history of Germany, and unfortunately, there are not a lot of Jews there to take people around these places, but they do have an amazing history, and a lot of people do have pride. They've taken classes, they've master's degrees, PhDs in Jewish history, studying Yiddish. I studied Yiddish when I was in England. I studied with several Germans who were not Jewish who were studying Yiddish because they were just interested in their history and their culture of learning about German history. And so they studied Yiddish. And I was amazed by how many people there were that were in Germany or in other parts of Europe that are learning about, and in Israel, learning about Jewish history from, anyways, it's not all, the history of German Judaism is not all the Shoah, it's not all Holocaust, and it's unfortunately other pogroms and the Crusades devastated huge parts of that area of Ashkenaz, but it's not all good, but it's not also all the Holocaust. So it is an interest of mine to have people discover that. And Judith knows we actually had talked about doing a tour of that area, specific, not just that area, but doing a history tour of Germany that would have included some of those places. And I think they're fascinating because, most American Jews could trace their history back to that place. So,
Yeah.
Obviously, that's where I came from.
You came from there. Your DNA tells you you're Ashkenazi. I know, but again, 90% of us. But to me, by the way, it's also, even though Jews lived in Poland for a long time. Jews started moving to Poland not long after that. 1100, 1200s, Jews started moving eastwards to Poland and to that part of the world, specifically Poland, let them in and encouraged them to come after the Crusades. But there is not much left. First of all, there's almost nothing to see in Poland that still stands from that. And those places that Judith is talking about, the mikveh and some of these old buildings, and quite frankly, it's also a lot of burial grounds of famous rabbis. Those things are very difficult to find in Poland. And we've done that. And Judith was actually on that trip that we did to Poland. Outside of Krakow, there's virtually no Jewish sites to see in Poland. Literally a handful across the entire country. Does not make for a very easy trip to Poland. And again,
No, Rabbi,
Poland are Holocaust related. Yeah.
Now we're on this subject. What about the Ukraine? Is there still sites in the Ukraine?
There are a few big sites in Ukraine, especially the burial place of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav in Uman. Thousands of Jews, especially Hasidic Jews, go to Uman every year.
My family's from Mogilev.
Yeah, but there's not a whole lot to see because most of the places were shtetls that, just have either been, just redeveloped over or just kind of became ghost towns. And even like I said, in Germany, the interesting things to see are a few synagogues that were built out of stone or were turned into churches and were preserved. Most of the buildings, interestingly, in Poland, which are newer, either didn't survive the war or were made out of wood and burned, and there was nothing left of them. So, and it's not because, I guess it was partly because they didn't have a lot of money, but it was also, that's just the way churches were built, out of wood in Poland and Ukraine. So it wasn't like, well, let's make something out of wood that can burn up easy. It's just that's what most of those synagogues were built, and some of them were gorgeous. I mean, you see some old photos of some of the synagogues there in Poland and Ukraine, and most of them are burned. Most of them were burned in the war, or just burned because they were eyesores and there were no Jews left in those places. But regardless, there's not a lot to see that you can actually travel around and see. Almost every one of these places we're talking about, they're essentially are going to cemeteries to visit where people were buried. A famous rabbi, a scholar, whatever. You're basically going to cemeteries, and that's the same thing in Uman. In it's UMAN. If you look it up, it's every year there's crazy things that happen in Uman as the Hasidim descend on the city, this little town, to be there for the yahrzeit remembrance of Rabbi Nachman. Anyways, and there are other places now that are like that, where burials of famous rebbes that are now turning into pilgrimage sites. But it's essentially, that's all you're seeing. I can't in good conscience take a trip and bring people to a place that's all they're going to see. But as those who went to Eastern Europe trip that we did, we tried to mix in also sites of general interest with the other sites, so that we went to Prague and we went to the synagogues in Prague, but we also saw, obviously the other sites and castles and places like that. And we were in Prague, or when we were in Budapest, Vienna, a lot of sites in Vienna that were not necessarily Jewish sites, but that were interesting from the standpoint of culture and importance there. And the same thing would go for Germany. If we have that trip to Germany, which we were planning right before COVID hit, right during COVID, if we do that Germany trip one day, we'll see obviously some sites that are connected to the Holocaust, that are connected to the ancient Ashkenazi heritage sites. But there will also be other sites there that have nothing to do with Judaism. I'm sure, Judith, you went up to the castle in Heidelberg, right? Judith, are you still there?
I'm here.
Go to Heidelberg Castle?
We went to Marksburg Castle. Marksburg? Yeah, Marksburg.
So there'll be some of those.
We didn't go into Heidelberg. That was not part of this itinerary.
Oh, really? But it sailed past it, didn't it? No?
Yes. Oh, yeah. We sailed past it, but we didn't go
You
in.
saw it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Waved.
You waved at the castle. Anyways, it is
We did. We
breathtaking
waved at
castle.
lots of things, but we had mimosas, so how could it be bad?
All right. Well, let's get enough with the travel. And I'll say one more thing about travel.
Did you hear the Lorelei?
Yes.
Good.
Well, that's important, by the way. You have to hear the Lorelei when you're down the Neckar. Wait. I do want to say we are getting our prices and our info out on the Israel trip. We got our initial prices, which were a little high, but then I realized they included all the dinners, and we normally don't include dinners on our trips. Not because we want to take away people's ability to have dinner. We just felt that most people like to have dinner on their own. So the price is going to come down a little bit. And so as soon as it's ready to announce our dates and our prices for Israel, we will have those out very soon. We're in that process of negotiating prices and dates. So we're pretty far down the road. So that's good news. And by the way, our tour guide's actually, Shai is actually going to be out here. Unfortunately, he's going to be out here over Thanksgiving, so no one's going to be here. So I'll be seeing him, and hopefully our birthright kids who went with him will have a chance to see him for a few hours, but he's here on that day of Thanksgiving. So anyways, I'm going to just remind people, some of you were here last week. We just began the book of Judges. We did not read a lot. We read the first chapter and just kind of introduced what happens in the book of Judges, which is, as Safaria describes it. Actually, let me just show you how Safaria describes it, because it's kind of funny in a way. Well, not funny. It's a cycle of sin, foreign oppression, repentance, and redemption through leaders appointed by God. And that is one way to describe Judges, which is the people are being persecuted. They cry out to God. God sends them a judge to help them. The judge wins a battle, and then the people are redeemed, and then they come back to a cycle of not doing what they're supposed to do, and they're delivered into the hands of a different oppressor. And so this is what happens in the book of Judges. It is a time that I've described to people before. There's a sense of lawlessness in the land, and that there's not a central authority, that there's, as the book often says, that people did right what was in their own eyes, and basically did whatever they wanted. And a lot of times it feels a little bit like the frontier. It feels like those Western movies where, the sheriff just got shot, and now who's going to take over and drive out the bad cowboys? Except in this case, it really is a sense of there are ethnic and cultural clashes between these people. So it'd almost be like, it's not really a good analogy then, but it becomes not only an issue of cultures and lifestyles, the social classes, between cowboys and city dwellers, but also between cowboys and Indians. Except in this case, it's a little bit more complicated because of really who's there first and whose promised land this is. But it would almost be as if the Native Americans came back to their land and found it occupied by white settlers, and then drove out those white settlers, and then found that the white settlers didn't quite leave the place. That might be the analogy that we could use here, other than the fact that, again, we're not even sure historically or archaeologically any of that is really true, that these people were actually probably closer in ethnicity and genetics, even, if you will, than the Bible wants to admit. But needless to say, the book of Judges does not deem the behavior of the Jews in a positive way. And what we finished with was a kind of a general overview in chapter 1 that the Israelites failed in getting rid of the Canaanites out of the area. And again, remember, the Bible treats the Canaanites as an occupying group, even though they seem to have been there for a while. There is this sense that they're not from the land of Israel initially. They're not supposed to be living in the land. They are, as we will read in our Wednesday night class tomorrow night, they are originally, at least according to the Bible, a Hamitic people, which means that they're originally from Africa. They're originally from Egypt in that area. But
so they were circumcised?
They were not circumcised. They if they had been Egyptian, they might have been, but not all Hamitic people are Egyptian. Egyptians are only one of the Hamitic people. There are the Ludites, there are the people from Put, there are other groups that are not necessarily just Egyptian, and one of those groups are the Canaanites. we don't know that's the case genetically. As I said before, the genetics of the Canaanites and Israelites might have been a lot closer than we'd like to admit. But the problem is that at least from the biblical standpoint, the way the Bible sees these Canaanites is they don't really belong there either. And God has definitely deemed that their time is over. And yet the Israelites, as we saw, were not successful at driving them out. And they, in some cases, were still there. They were, in some cases, fairly powerful. And in some cases, as we just read, they sometimes became tributaries. They sometimes became vassal peoples to the Israelites. The Canaanites, interestingly, are not the main problem in the book of Judges. They are not the main foe, though it does seem that they are part of a large part of the problem because they constantly lead the Israelites away from worshiping God. And then that allows these other people like the Philistines or the Midianites to take power. But there are Canaanite peoples that are a problem, and we are going to read about them today. But it's interesting that it's not just Canaanites that are the problems for Israel during the time of the Judges. So I want to make that clear. It's not like you're going to read about this fight between the Canaanites and the Israelites and that's really what's going on here. Not. Trust me, it's very clear that it's not just Canaanites who are trying to control the area. So we're going to read in chapter 2. And this is kind of like, again, what we read. Joshua has died. There is not really one leader. Eleazar died, the priest that was Aaron's son, and he passes his baton, if you will, Eleazar, to his son Pinchas. But there is not a really strong political leader anymore after Joshua died. So here's what happens in chapter 2. I'm going to turn this over to Rosemary to read chapter 2.
And an angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I caused you to go up out of Mitzrayim and have brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall pull down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Moreover, I said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as snares to you, and their gods shall be a trap to you.
So what we just heard in a couple of lines is essentially the motif for why this is a problem, which is that I made a covenant with you. I'm your God. You made a covenant. I told you not to make covenants or treaties with the Canaanites. I told you to drive them out. You've not done that. You were supposed to pull down their altars. You did not do that. And now you're worshiping their gods. And so this essentially is the cycle begins here with this lack of faith and this disregard for the rules. So again, I brought you out of Egypt. This is what was supposed to happen. We had a covenant. We had an agreement. You've broken the agreement. Now, I will tell you that it is interesting to notice that it is an angel that speaks to them here. It is not a leader like Moses speaking on behalf of God. It is not God. So there is a recognition that something different is happening here now than happened before, in that there's no longer a prophet speaking on behalf of God. There's no God speaking on behalf of God. There's an angel speaking on behalf of God. Now that's significant. I mean, if a bunch of people get to hear an angel, that's significant. But there is a recognition that some level of connection to God has changed. And that's really what I want to, that's all I'm saying, is there is something that has changed with the relationship that these people have between themselves and God. It's not like it was before.
I think you skipped
Oh,
something.
I might have skipped a line. Yeah. No, it's here. And it came to pass.
And it came to pass, when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voice and wept. And they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord.
So they named the place tears or crying. Bochim means crying. So place of tears.
And when Yehoshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man to his inheritance to possess the land. And the people served the Lord all the days of Yehoshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Yehoshua, who had seen all the great work of the Lord that he did for Israel. And Yehoshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old.
Yeah. So now, why do we have this repetition of this thing about Joshua here? Because we already read it. I mean, for those who weren't here last week, I'm just going to go back and show you that it begins with this. I mean, we also read at the end of the book of Joshua, but the book of Judges actually tells us that Joshua is dead as well. So here we have it repeated again here in chapter 2. But it almost is as if this part really is to tell us that that this is really what. Well, let's actually finish a little bit more before we get to that.
And they buried him in the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill Gaash. And also all that generation were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel.
Yeah, and that seems to be the point here, is that there is a generational change with the death of Joshua and with that generation, that people don't know God anymore. They didn't have that experience of coming out of Egypt. They didn't have that experience of going through the covenant when in the book of Joshua, Joshua takes over and has everybody recovenant themselves to God in front of God. Now they're getting spoken to by angels. They are getting less and less of that experience of being redeemed themselves that their parents had and their grandparents had. And so there's a recognition that there's just an experience where these people just didn't have it. They didn't. There are people who no longer have those experiences. And we know what that's like when we see people who lived through the Holocaust who've died. We see people who lived through the Depression, that we're almost there's hardly anybody now who actually remembers what it was like to live through the Depression. I mean, you literally are over 100 years old if you remembered, what it was like to be a kid during the Depression. And so there's generational memories that just they're only talked about. They can't be talked about by people who actually experience them. They can only be talked about by those who've heard the stories and who've talked to those people. And so this is what's happened here to the Israelites, is that they've lost that connection. And that's where it says they did not know the Lord, nor the work that God had done for Israel. So there is a recognition that connection's gone, which now leads us to this.
And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baalim. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Mitzrayim, and followed other gods of the people that were round about them, and bowed themselves down to them and provoked the Lord to anger.
So they don't know God. They don't know the experiences of leaving Mitzrayim, of leaving Egypt. And so they start serving other gods. Now, it doesn't just say that they served other gods. It says they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Is that because they were serving other gods that they were doing evil in the sight of God? Or is it because they were doing evil in addition, or because of maybe the fact that they were serving other gods? And so it's not just that they're worshiping other gods, it's that they're doing bad things. Now, again, it could be the bad things for God or that you're worshiping other gods, but it's also possible that they're engaging in human sacrifice, that they're doing things that the Canaanites were doing that were completely abhorrent to the sensibilities of the Israelites. So it's not maybe just the fact that they were worshiping other gods. And specifically, again, it's not one Baal, it's Baalim, meaning that all these Baals that they're worshiping. And again, Baal is the generic name for these gods that inhabited different parts of the country, different places, different mountains, different rivers, different weather-related phenomenon. The Baalim are a wide group of gods that included many different forms of worship in ancient Canaan. And we've recovered and know about a lot of these Baals. And we found statues, and we found our altars, and we found graffiti, and we found different poems and prayers specifically in Lebanon, that also they were worship Baals in the Canaanite communities in Lebanon. And we know a lot more about the Baal worship than we did 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 1,000 years ago. We know a lot more about it today. And interestingly, probably the most famous Baal is Baal Zavov, the Lord of the Flies, which was one of the Baals that were worshipped in Canaan and became synonymous with Beelzebub, one of the names for the devil. But Baal Zavov is literally the Lord of the Flies, or Lord of the Bees, or Lord of the Fly, fly. Makes a Zavov sound. It's an onomatopoeia. It's a sound that that a bee or a fly makes. And they were worshiping not one, but several different types of Baals. Oftentimes the Bible doesn't include the name of the Baal that they're worshiping because it doesn't really matter to the authors of the Bible. It doesn't matter to the authors because they're all bad. There's not a good Baal, they're all bad. But sometimes it just says Baal. Generally speaking, there was probably, well, not generally, there was a Baal in particular that they were talking about. Baal, Baal Hinnom, Baal, Baal Tzefon. I mean, there are a lot of Baals. Lots of times the Bible doesn't tell us which Baal they're worshiping because it doesn't matter. They're all bad. Yeah.
You know what I find interesting? That there's actually a word in Hebrew for Baalim.
Well, it's such a generic word that it's difficult. It's difficult not to have it, and that's the interesting thing. So now,
in the Michamoka prayer, it says literally, "Who is like our God among the Baalim that are worshipped?" Mm-hmm. So they're comparing God to the Baal.
That's true.
Making him one of them.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because the word Baal literally means Lord. Mm-hmm. It is synonymous with Lord. It is actually, so I don't mean Lord, our Lord, Adonai, but it's the same word in English. We translate it as Baal is Lord. So Lord of the Flies, is we call it Lord. In Hebrew, the word Baal literally means husband. So in Hebrew, an ish is a man, right? So ish is a man. But if you're married, it's your Baal, right? Your husband, and your ishto is your wife. That doesn't mean bride and groom. We have different words for that. We have hatan and kala, or bridegroom Chatan is a bridegroom and a kala is a bride. But when you're actually married, you're a Baal and Ishto. You're the husband and his wife, Eshet, the wife. Just keep that in mind. I mean, so Baal is actually means also husband, but it's from the name of Lord or master or whatever. But it's not just that. It's not just there. I mean, it's the word Baal is all over Hebrew because it became, I mean, it's the word for Lord or master or man of the house. It's the word Baal Habayit, right? Which means master of the house, Lord of the house. So Baal Habayit literally means the Lord of the house. It doesn't mean God of the house. It doesn't mean it, but it's got the same origin. It has the same root as Baal, as Lord. So the word Baalabusta in Yiddish is the master of the house. Baal Habayit, Balabas, Balabait becomes Balabas, and Balabusta is the feminine version of the master of the house, who's always the woman, right? A Balabusta is what you call the mother who runs the house, is the Balabusta. That's the title of respect and honor and fear for the master, for the mistress of the house. So the funny thing is the word actually is all over Hebrew. It's all over it. You can't escape it. So so what the Bible does, interestingly, it oftentimes doesn't. It does what you're asserting, Mike, is really, why would we have this? We don't want to keep this word around. So what they really do is they actually overuse the word, or in some cases, like, because they don't recognize the proper noun for the Baal, they strip it of its context, and they strip it of its meaning, of what its real meaning is. I don't know if that's necessarily intentional. It might have been, but the bottom line is that the effect of it is that the word Baal means nothing, because it doesn't really refer to the God anymore. And so we don't really think about it, except in the context of right here, Ed HaBaalim. And again, there it's like, yeah, all those gods, all those Baal gods. So we also have the word Elohim, which means gods in a generic form, right? And so it says that
El
the
is also a name of a
Elohim.
god.
What?
El is also a name of a god.
Yep. Well, it also is Michamocha.
Yeah.
It's Ba'elim. Actually, in Michamocha, Rosemary, it's Ba'elim. It's not Baal. It's actually Ba'elim, which is the root of Ale. It's okay. I mean, it's the same effect, which is it's
misreading it.
It's amongst the God. No, it's amongst the gods. It's the Aleph. It's Ba'elim, which is a version of Elohim. So Elohim or Elim means literally gods, which is a whole, by the way, another thing we've talked about before. Why is God called Elohim, which is a plural, and it should be El by itself, which is a God. But Elohim is what God's name is as a God. But in some contexts, like here, it's not Elohim, it's not God, it's clearly gods. Achrei Elohim Acherim, which is after other gods. And then Elohei Hamim, which is the gods of the other nations. And so we have Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei, in the Amidah, we say Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak. So we have the word Elohei, means Elohim Shel, it means the gods of, in this case, but in when we translate it as Elohei Avraham, we don't say the gods of Avraham, we say the God of Avraham, because we recognize that in the context, when we talk about Elohim, our God, it's a plural form, but it's always God as a singular. And so that's the weird thing about it, is that the construct is plural, but it's never referred to as plural. And I want to make that clear. Every verb construct in Hebrew, where it talks about God, Elohim, not out of Yud Hey Vav Hey, but Elohim, every time the construct of Elohim is used, it is, by the way, it is always a singular. It is a singular verb. It is always.
Oh.
So just so you know, it's always a singular. It's always a singular verb. it is recognized that the construct of the noun is plural, but the verb attached to Elohim is always a singular male verb, which again, in Hebrew, every verb is conjugated by tense, by gender, and by singular or plural. Every Hebrew verb is always conjugated that way, which makes Hebrew a really hard language to teach and learn. The conjugation is what really hurts us. I mean, there's things we have in English that make it a maddening language, but Hebrew is tough because you have the verbs, the conjugation of the verbs. It is a very difficult language to learn from that standpoint, the verb conjugation. Anyways.
For some time, I've had this heretical thought that though God is one, God is nonetheless multiple. That is, the aspects of God are so grand, are so immense, that it's hard not to see God as multiple, though one.
Yep.
Although I've given up Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, I think it's more than that, or less than that, or.
Oh, no, I think, and you're right. I mean, that was always the argument with Kabbalistic structures that talked about God in Sphirot and 10 emanations of God, that God is this, God can be looked at with these different words. It's always been this problem of whether we use the word God. The way that some people come to terms with it is to use the word Godhead, which is
Right.
also problematic in that, what does that even mean? But yeah, it's very easy. It's very easy to do that.
Is it possible that the angels, with their variety of work and responsibility, are simply an aspect of God?
Well, that was another route that people would go to, was with the angelic aspects of divinity, if you will, and talking about those angels being emanations of God. So you had that in Judaism, at least. You had that. You have the Kabbalistic elements. In Christianity, obviously, you have a veneration of saints. They have different aspects of God's power, to protect travelers or to protect fishermen or whatever. So people found ways of doing that. And Judaism always said, well, look, if you're gonna make an issue of Christians having a Trinity, why are you making God tenfold in the Kabbalistic structures? So Jews knew that this was a difficult aspect of again, are we splitting God off into numerous parts? In which case, and if you're going to do 3 and you're going to do 10, you might as well do 10,000 and be like, the Indian, like the Hindu culture. So it was difficult.
Which makes sense.
Where you go. And that's why when you said, well, is it really, in the end of the day, then you have to come back to one. But these different aspects of God I think Judaism talks about it really early on, which is why we say Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzhak, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka. We don't just say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in our prayer. We say the God of Abraham, the God of Sarah, the God of Jacob. We understand that God appeared to these people completely differently. And the lesson from it is that God doesn't appear to anybody the same way. It's impossible. And I try to teach this to kids. I was just talking to the Hebrew school about this last week. How can I tell you what God looks like when there's no way that God I wouldn't engage in God the same way you would. Well, God wouldn't look to me. I said, anyone who tells you that what God looks like is essentially trying to push an idol on you, which is what Judaism's been fighting against for 2,000 years. We've been fighting for people not to have one image of God. And even in our own lifetime, how could God appear to us the same way every time? So even Moses doesn't have God, gets to see God more than anybody, doesn't have God appearing always the same way. Sometimes in a bush, sometimes in a pillar, sometimes on the mountain in a still small voice. So even God doesn't appear to Moses the same way. So I try to teach kids, anybody who tells you what God looks like is probably selling you something that you shouldn't buy. And so I think that's the biggest challenge is how do you have a religion where essentially you're telling people you're going to experience God in a different way, which again, where does that, then you're basically saying, oh, go experience God any way you want. And then that's where people go, well, then I can't control you. If I don't tell you what God looks like, then you can't we can't all, we can't be on the same page, which it's a problem for religion.
But it's a fascinating problem.
Yeah, but it's one that unfortunately you almost have to have people have the freedom to imagine things and to live a life where they have that freedom to be able to allow them to have and to encourage them to have a belief system that also has that freedom. Because essentially, if you're trying to control people, you don't give them that freedom of how they're going to imagine God. You can't. You actually literally say, well, we're just encouraging anarchy by letting people just believe anything they want to believe. And that's where people fall back down that hole of saying, oh, we have to tell them what God looks like. It's a constant problem of which we actually see in the book of Judges. We'll actually see that, with the fact that they're doing kind of whatever they want to do.
Well, one of the benefits of being able to understand that God appears to each of us in a different manner, it allows for an authenticity of our experience. So it's not a rote thing that we've read.
Yeah. But it almost only works if you live in a culture and society that allows for freedom of expression every day and in other aspects of your life, whether it's, your gender identity, whether it's your, political views, whether it's your artistic sensibilities. If you don't live in a world like that, then it almost doesn't even make sense. So it's easy for us to say today, I don't know, it's not easy for us to imagine our ancestors even 2 generations ago to have that kind of freedom. And how do you hold it all together? I mean, how do you hold the center together? Where's the center that people can agree on to even worship together if there's no sense on agreement in the first place? That's the one thing that I don't really know. I don't really have an answer on. I mean, I've thought about it a lot, believe me. I wrestle with it a lot of times, because if you don't have a common language or a common sensibility on what God looks like or what God is or how people pray, then what do you even teach? Like, how do you even guide somebody? I mean, I don't know. Those are the challenges for religion in a non-theocratic or and hopefully an open society.
This is probably one of the reasons that we taken on all religions almost have taken on some of the traditions of the religions around them in order to have a common language. We can see even our own religion, like El and Baal,
Good point.
so that we have a common religion. I don't know. I was reading too. It was so funny. This woman was making the comment that with today's sensibilities, why couldn't, like, especially when Solomon had a lot of wives and brought in different cultures and stuff, like, why couldn't we have just accepted these cultures? Why couldn't we have, have let them have their own religion? But then when you look at these religions at this time, they're doing human sacrifice.
Yeah.
They're slashing themselves. They're doing some pretty awful things.
Yes.
It's not, not like Christianity or Islam.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Gail. So this is where it's easy for us to kind of like overlay our experiences onto theirs, and it wasn't that simple. And you're right. I mean, Solomon probably had a really good reason to bring in these different wives and these different cultures. He's trying to make Israel an urban, he's trying to bring the Israelites into their own as a regional power.
He's trying to protect trade routes.
And he did what a leader would do. But you're right. The problem is that what these other cultures at the time also are practicing, which is why, and again, I mean, we know what we have because we have our Bible, but yes, the problem is that doing evil in the sight of God might also have included the human sacrifices, the cultic prostitution, which again, you go, well, it's cultic prostitution. Maybe they were just having fun. Yeah, but what if these kids were being sold into, I mean,
Yeah, human
pretty much
trafficking.
are pretty, we're not 100% sure, but we're pretty sure that when we're talking about cultic prostitution, we're not talking about people who necessarily had any say in this, that they're literally sexually trafficked into situations where they're forced to be cultic prostitutes to a god that's not their god. I mean, I don't even want to think about, now I have, but I don't even want to think about what this might have looked like in the ancient world. When we're talking about what Canaanite practice looked like, it can go to some pretty dark places. And again, part of it might have been propaganda, but it's not just propaganda, because we have excavated some of these cultic sites and have found massive, burial sites of infants, which seem to imply either really bad human sacrifice or massive amounts of aborted fetuses on a scale that, like, we don't even want to think about. So it's difficult for us to imagine, thankfully, in some ways, but it's also hard for us to even comprehend it because of the world that we live in today. But again, some of it might have just been, look, it's all bad, so just don't do any of it. Like this next line, this one right in particular.
And they forsook the Lord and served the Baal and the Ashtaroth.
And by the way, there it's very clear that it's not just Baal, but here we have Ashtaroth, which is a feminine deity. It is or deities. These are feminine deities that are also very important for fertility rituals. We found many Ashtaroth. We found many statues of Astarte all over the land of Israel. We found these women fertility goddesses, sculptures everywhere, like everywhere. Not a lot of Baals. We found a whole lot of fertility objects, and these Ashtaroth are everywhere. And that's that is part of the worship as well. And of course, it's not going to have a good result.
I have when Tamar goes to Judah and she's a cult prostitute, or she says she's a cult prostitute.
Yeah.
What was he doing with a prostitute?
Well, the bigger issue is in one place she's called a cultic prostitute, and in the other place she's called just a flat out prostitute. She does not seem to have been a cultic prostitute in the first place. It says the first time it says that when he went to see her, she was a zonah. He thought of her as a prostitute, which is essentially like a streetwalker / escort. The other time he describes her as a kadesha, which is a cultic prostitute, which is the way he describes her. He might have, I just want to say in that story, and I do believe this, that he is describing her as a kadesha mainly because he doesn't want to admit that he just saw her as a common streetwalker, which basically means that there were different levels in society between that situation, and he's okay with saying that he went to a cultic prostitute, which you'd think is not good either.
Right. I'm thinking, did we have cult prostitutes?
He could argue, that he's hanging out with his Canaanite friends, which it says he is, by the way. It says flat out that Judah is hanging out with his Canaanite. He's hanging out with Adullam. He's literally hanging out with Canaanites. He's doing their kinds of stuff. But it seems like, and again, I could be wrong, and it's a theory, and it's not my theory, but it's a theory that because there were different types of prostitutes, that it might have been culturally or like socially okay to say that he did that. It doesn't matter. The Bible says that he saw her at first as a zonah, as a prostitute. He does not see her as a cultic prostitute. He sees her as a street. I don't want to use the word streetwalker, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. But there's a prostitute, and then there's a cultic prostitute. And at least when he sees her, he goes to her thinking that she's a prostitute. When he describes her to others, he calls her a kadesha, but he does not see her as that when he first goes to see her. And I don't believe they're interchangeable, by the way. They're two different words. They're used in different contexts. Neither one are okay from the Jewish standpoint, from like encouraging that kind of behavior, but there clearly is a difference, and he described them differently. And again, it could be just a mistake. It could be a scribal error. It could be like we didn't really care, but it is possible that the story is actually telling you that Judah thinks he can get away with describing her as a cultic prostitute, which isn't as bad as that he just went to see a common streetwalker. Anyway,
so I just wondered how much of these cultures from other people we took, that.
I will tell you that at least in that story, he's going to a Canaanite. He thinks he's going to a Canaanite woman, which, by the way, Tamar was. So before we go, oh, she is a Canaanite woman. The Bible tells us right off the bat she's a Canaanite woman. So whatever she is, she's definitely Canaanite, and she's the hero. She's the heroine of the story. By the way, I just want to make it clear that woman / daughter-in-law / prostitute imposter is the hero of the story, is the heroine, is the one at the end of the story. Judah says, she was right and I was wrong. So he admits it, and she's the hero of the story, and she becomes our ancestor. So it's all in the end, it's not irrelevant, but it all ends up that she's the good person. And she's one of several, as we talked about in Joshua a few weeks ago, Rahav, several stories of, and I don't want to say the hooker with the heart of gold, but literally the stories are, don't think that these women are not only are they not redeemable, they're heroes. They are redeemed, and they are the agents of facilitating goodness and good things. So there is a interesting takeaway that these women, which what you would have seen would have been the most vulnerable, actually are the heroes of our tales, which is great. I mean, I think it's great. I think it's teaching us not to look down on people and not to.
So I was thinking that the cult prostitutes could be women that were widows, like Tamar, or women that you didn't have a lot of choices then. Do you know, if you didn't have sons, if you didn't have daughters, besides being a slave or maybe an unwanted daughter or something, you could end up as a cult prostitute.
It could be, but it also could be that these were people who did not have a choice and who kind of were raised in that, we just don't know. But I will tell you, this is part of the culture, the Canaanite culture, that seemed to have been part of the daily life of Canaanites, and was not supposed to be the daily life of Israelites. You are not supposed to hire your daughter off as a prostitute, as a zonah, as a streetwalker. The Bible says that specifically. And obviously they're not supposed to be a kadesha. They're not supposed to be a kadesh or a kadesha, a male or female cult prostitute, because then they're not only engaging in the sex outside of marriage and procreation, they're also engaging in worship of another god. So that is a big no-no. All right, so what's happening with God's reaction to this badness?
And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could not any longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed.
So not good things happening. Every time they did this, they get punished. And it's God who's actually punishing them. But
having trouble with my system here. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who saved them from the hand of their plunderers. And yet they would not hearken to their judges, but they went astray after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly out of the way in which their fathers had gone, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not do so.
Yep. And so this is the prologue, or the explanation for what we're about to see, because we haven't read about it yet. You haven't missed it, but they're telling you what is going to happen. So this is the setup where they're going to tell you what you're about to see before you've seen it.
And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge and saved them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord relented on account of their groanings caused by those that oppressed them and vexed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they relapsed and became more corrupt than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and to bow down to them. They omitted nothing of their practices nor of their stubborn way.
Yeah. And so we haven't read it, but it's now told us what the cycle is going to be. The people are doing bad. God sends an oppressor. God, they cry out because they're being oppressed. God sends them a judge. The judge helps them win. The judge dies. They go back to their behavior and they cycle, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And this is what happens.
And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, because this people has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not hearkened to my voice, I also will not continue to drive out from before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died.
Yeah. They already didn't do what they were supposed to do. They didn't drive them out under Joshua's time. They were not driving them out now. And God's basically saying, I'm not going to help them be driven out now. I will not drive them out, which almost is like, a parent telling their kids, I'm not going to take care of you anymore. And I'm not going to stop you from getting in trouble. And the kids don't care anyways, because they're already getting into trouble anyways. So it's almost like God is telling them, I'm not going to do what I promised to do for you so that you'd be in better shape. And the people don't really care anyways. So it's a very strange cycle where there's an admission here by the authors, and we sometimes say it's the same author as Deuteronomy. So it's called the Deuteronomist, is basically saying, look, God would have done this stuff, but we didn't do our job. And because we didn't do our job and didn't follow the rules, God didn't help us do our job. But, in that cycle of dysfunction, but we don't care. Like, step outside of this for a second and go, so what? They didn't care. The Israelites didn't care. They didn't want the Canaanites gone. They had no issue with the Canaanites. They're like, okay, there's a Canaanite neighbor. I don't care. He has gods. Well, the gods are cool too. I'll worship their gods. What's wrong with their gods? Seem okay to me. Of course, this is not okay to the authors of the book, this book, and at least maybe through the book of Kings. This is not okay. They broke in the covenant. And that is the word right here, my friends. Briti, my covenant. They have broken the brit. This covenant is so important to the author of Deuteronomy because it's the function of the whole system. It's God working through prophets and judges and kings to enforce an agreement between God and the people people don't want to keep the covenant. The people don't want to keep it. And so when they don't keep it, God doesn't keep his end. But do the people even care? Okay, so I also
will not continue to drive out from before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, that through them I may put Israel to the proof, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did keep it or not. Therefore, the Lord left those nations without driving them out hastily, and he did not give them up into the hand of Joshua.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, some of this, they're basically saying goes, at the end of the day, it goes back to the fact that they didn't drive them out during Joshua's time. But now it's been reframed, which isn't just that. It's not just that the people didn't want to drive them out. Now God is saying, I'm going to leave them there to constantly challenge the people and essentially to make them your trap. And so the authors here have now not only said the people didn't want to do it, but that God is now going to cooperate with this plan and let these nations continue to help us screw up. And so it's really, if you think about it, I don't know what else to say other than this. This is somebody looking back at the history and trying to explain why things are the way they are, and to literally explain why Canaanites are still in the land, we're still screwing up, we're still worshiping other gods. And it seems as though God must now buy into this plan, and not only like buy into it, but is facilitating this plan. And folks, this is a very common thing to do in Jewish history, which is to read Jewish history as a cycle of tragedies that God visits on the people in order to teach them a lesson. And it is a way of reading history, which is, when you really think about it, it gives some people a context and a sensibility and a acceptance of the way things are, which they can feel comfortable with and they can live with. Because when bad things happen to them, they deserved it. And to a large extent caused it. People are being punished for not keeping the covenant. And God is not only allowing it to happen, but facilitating it to happen. So this is a problem, folks. I mean, this is a covenantal theology, which we're still in the cycle of. I mean, we haven't escaped this yet. We have a whole lot of our people who believe this and who this is their theology as Jews. And it's not Canaanites. It's Crusaders and Inquisition and Nazis and any anti-Semite. That the anti-Semite or the murderer or the Cossack or whoever it is that's killing Jews at that point is actually an agent of God meeting punishment on people for not doing the right thing. And so this is this is a problem. I mean, to me, it's a problem because it offends my understanding of God and kind of why people suffer. But you deserve it, and God is punishing you for you're not doing the right thing.
I was going to say in the other class that I've heard even people talk about the mark of Cain as being black. So this is, you're supposed to be a slave and you're supposed to be a servant, and
that's part of another issue, which is if this is part of God's plan, then the plan is this is the plan.
There's the Bible for justification for your own biases.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. But there's this other issue, which is when people talk about the Holocaust happening as a punishment for Jews leaving leaving tradition, it upsets me. But how do you even argue with it? I mean, you basically just have to listen to people justify the murder of 1.5 million children by saying, well, because Jews stopped keeping kosher.
Right.
I mean, that I get so upset with that I can't, there's nothing I can even respond to with that. Almost a different religion, but their basis for it is in the Bible. It's not like they're making it up. I know they're not making it up. I know their precedents are within the Bible itself. So, let us go into chapter 3 now, where we're actually going to read about one of those judges in particular. But first, a little bit more intro. There's a few more verses of intro before we get into our first judge.
Now these are the nations which the Lord left to put Israel to the proof by them, all those who had not known all the wars of Canaan, only that the generations of the children of Israel might know, to teach them war, at the least such as before knew nothing of these matters. Namely, 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Zidoni, and the Hivi that dwelt in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon to the entrance of Hamath.
Yeah, and so now we get some specifics here. These are nations which God allowed to stay in the land of Israel, the territory of the tribes, and these are left here so that the Israelites might learn how to fight them. Again, it very much seems like a way of explaining how things are the way, or how things were the way they were, which is that these Canaanites were still there. They were not driven out. There's also Philistines. The Plishtim are the Philistines, and the Hivites, which are another. I mean, we would say that they're essentially other Canaanites, but there are like the Sidoni, the people from Sidon. These are people that live in the north, in the area around the mountains of Lebanon, modern day Lebanon, northern Israel.
I thought the Hivi were Hittites, no?
No, that's a different one. So there are Hittites and there are Hivites. So
Okay.
there are 2 different groups. The Hivites, Hittites are a little difficult to describe as Canaanites, because the Hittites, we see them as a separate, we see them by, I say, archaeology and by science, as a separate group of people that lived in modern day Turkey, who had a fairly vast empire that went into the northern part of Israel. And actually the Egyptians fought against the Hittites. But the Bible always groups the Hittites together with the Canaanites. Maybe again, there was so much cultural, diffusion between the groups that it really didn't matter to the Israelites. But today we would say there's a definite Hittite culture and there's a definite Canaanite culture. Hittite culture was probably, well, not probably, it was much larger geographically and more powerfully culturally. But as far as the average Israelite might have been concerned, it was there. Doesn't matter. It's not ours, and they worship other gods, and maybe they start calling each other's gods by the same names. They're all worshiping Baal, or they're all worshiping, a mixture of Hittite and Canaanite gods. But this is all stuff these are people that are around that we didn't drive out. And here's what they do.
And they were for putting Israel to the proof, to know whether they would hearken to the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Moses. And the children of Israel dwelt among the Canaanites, the Hittites, and the Amori, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites.
Yeah, and so, occasionally, we get slightly different permutations of them, but these 7 nations, we call them the 7 nations, are usually, again, either mentioned together, or in here we had 2 different clusters: the Jebusites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Amori, the Hittites, the Canaanites. There are also, and then Philistines are different. That's another group that's different. And the Philistines the Philistines are definitely different, but they're Aegean. They're from the Greek Isles like Crete and Cyprus. But again, they put Israel to the test. They are going to be there to see whether the Israelites are paying attention or not. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that.
And they took their daughters to be their wives, and gave their daughters to their sons, and served their gods. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baalim and the Ashtaroth. Therefore, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, and the children of Israel served Cushan Rish Atayim 8 years.
Yeah. And so here's a weird thing.
Never heard of
that
him.
it says that we married them. We didn't just serve their gods, but we married them. And so obviously it's easier to worship their gods when they're your sons and daughter-in-law, right? So this is a part now of their culture, and what we're going to see is the fact that it gets even harder to it's going to get even harder to separate, because they're now part of your family. And so our first problem are these people from Aram, which is Syria. It's not even the Canaanites. Aram is a northern kingdom in modern day Syria, and they're not even, these are not even the Canaanites. So here's they take over, they assumedly made us vassals. They imposed power over us. And here's what we do.
And when the children of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, namely Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel and went out to war. And the Lord gave Rishatayim, king of Aram, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Cushan Rish Atayim.
Yeah, and so we don't know a lot about Othniel, except he's the first judge. And he is, well, actually, we'll read one more line here.
And the land was quiet for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died.
Yeah, so we don't know a lot about him. I mean, you just read what we know about him. He's from the tribe of Judah. He is actually a nephew of Caleb, who's again, Caleb is the leader of the Judahites. He's the one who, like Joshua, the only two of the 12 spies that come back with a good report. They get to survive. They're the only people from that generation that came out of Egypt. So he's from a distinguished family. He is the son of Kenaz, who's the brother of Caleb. So he's Caleb's nephew. So the Judahites are the ones responsible for the first judge. We're going to see the judges come from different tribes. Many of the tribes will throw up a judge or two. It's not like they all come from the same tribe. They're actually a interesting spread across the tribes. And things are not, it's not what you'd like to have, which is you want to have a central government and a army that can protect you and things like that. But in this system of judges, you have a guy who comes up, he meets a specific foe, an enemy, and he beats them. And in this case, there's 40 years of quiet, which is actually a fairly long time. I mean, that's probably more of a symbolic number, but it's a long time. 40 years is a great length of time to be at peace. But the cycle continues.
And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel, and they seized the city of palm trees. So the children of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, for 18 years.
Yes. And now remember, Moab is also not in the land of Israel. It's across the border in the land of Jordan, modern day Jordan. He's a Moab, King Eglon. He's a Moabite. He's from that descendants of Lot's family, right? Lot's illegitimate, not Lot's incestuous product of his daughters, right? He has two sons with these two daughters, Moab and Ben-Ami, the ancestor of the Ammonites. And so Eglon gets his Ammonite kinsfolk, his cousins, the Ammonites, a separate kingdom. And he also gets the Amalekites to fight against Israel. And it seems as though they seized an ear of a city of palm trees, Ir HaTamarim. In the scope of things, it doesn't seem like that's a huge loss, but it's enough of a loss that the people see this as a problem. Did everybody see it as a problem? Did every Israelite see that this King Eglon was a problem? I don't know. But we get a new judge, a new warrior, and here's our hero.
But when the children of Israel cried to the Lord raised them up a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gerah, a Benjaminite, a left-handed man, and by him the children of Israel sent a present to Eglon, the king of Moab.
And you're going to see what that present is in a second. So this is Ehud. He's the next judge. He's a Benjaminite. And what we learn about the Benjaminites, who are literally Ben Hayamini, they're the Benjamin, the son of my right hand, the son of my strength. The Benjaminites, ironically, are left-handed. Now, how do you make a whole tribe left-handed? Probably through a lot of hard work and training. You train a whole nation of guys to fight with their left hand, as southpaws. Very, very difficult to battle against left-handed fighters. If everyone's left-handed that you're fighting against, they have a huge advantage. So the Benjaminites seem to have taken a play off of their names and turned themselves into left-handed fighters. Did they use left hand for everything? Maybe you had to in order to get people to be left-handed. But when you fight and hold a sword with your left hand, it's very difficult for people who are right-handed to be able to defend against it. The same way that left-handed boxers have a huge advantage, same way why left-handed pitchers have a huge advantage. People are not used to that left hand. Now, the only way you count a left-handed pitcher is with a left-handed batter, and that doesn't always work out well, but that's the concept of having a bunch of left-handed batters, is so that you can bat against those left-handed pitchers who would normally have an advantage over you where they could throw the ball. So it's a similar thing in battle. The Benjaminites play off of that, and we're going to see a story later on in the Judges of how good the Benjaminites are at fighting. For a small tribe, they are very powerful militarily, and this seems to be what they're known for, which is fighting and being very, very good at fighting. So the question of whether the Moabites, as Judith just pointed out, they're in the land of Jordan. Part of that territory is controlled by the Reubenites and Gadites and the half tribe of Manasseh. But there's other parts of that area that are definitely supposed to be Moabite and definitely not supposed to. There are definitely parts of that land that are Moabite, and there are definitely parts that are Ammonite that are still controlled by those kingdoms. Did they want Israelites on that side? I was going to say on their side of the Jordan. No, they didn't want them, which is why they probably took back a city of palm trees that was in their territory. But yes, it might have been an area that was inhabited by Reubenites or Israelites, or maybe they crossed over into Jericho and took that part of Jericho, which was known as the city of palm trees. Maybe they took this territory from Israel. Whatever it was, the Moabites with their Ammonite kinsfolk and Amalekites are now a problem for us. And so here we have Ehud is going to step up and be our vindicator. Is it supposed to be like this? The Bible, the book of Judges says that this is what happens. And so Ehud is going to be we'll see what he does. But he fights with his left hand.
But Ehud made him a sword which had 2 edges of a cubit length, and he girded it under his clothes on his right thigh. And he brought the present to Eglon, king of Moab, and Eglon was a very fat man.
Yeah, so I will tell you, this is not a politically correct story. It's also very disgusting and violent story, as we're about to see. It's very Game of Thrones. Actually, there's a scene in Game of Thrones that comes right out of this scene, comes right out of this scene from the Bible. Yeah, usually when you see a story beginning, he has a sword with 2 edges on it. Something here is, and he's hiding it under his clothes. There's a lot of foreshadowing in this story. You don't really have to imagine what's about to happen.
And when he had finished offering the present, he sent away the people that bore the present. But he himself turned back after reaching the carved stones that were by Gilgal and said, I have a secret errand to you, O king. The latter said, keep silence. And all that stood by him went out from him.
Okay, so he says to the king Eglon, I've got a special thing to tell you. And again, this is by Gilgal, which is the place that the Israelites first crossed into under Joshua. This is that border, if you will.
And Ehud came to him, and he was sitting in a cool upper chamber, which he had for himself alone. And Ehud said, I have a message from God to you. So he arose out of his seat.
Yeah, so there's a real question of what's going on here. Is he sitting on a throne in a cool upper chamber of his house? Or is he sitting on a toilet? They had toilets. We've actually excavated recently, as some of you read, a toilet from later than this, but not ridiculously later, talking about maybe 400 years, 300 or 400 years later, we found a private toilet in the city of Kings in Ir David, in the city of David, the area of maybe where King David lived, sorry. And it could be that, again, most people didn't have a private toilet, but the king could have had a private toilet. And so is he in the toilet when Ehud gives him his special message from God? Ehud says, I have a special message from God. So the word kiseh literally means seat, but it would be the same word for toilet. Same word. So we don't know. Difference of opinion, but on what this actually is. But you could now imagine what the message from God is.
And Ehud put forth his left hand and took the sword from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. And the haft also went in after the blade, and the fat closed upon the blade, so that he could not draw the dagger out of his belly, and the dirt came out.
Yeah, and this is kind of why we think maybe he's sitting in the bathroom. Well, first of all, the whole story is kind of weird. Look, the reason that they described him as being so fat is because in this stabbing that just happened, this was a stabbing, folks. This was a in case you didn't get fully what happened here, he was so corpulent, that's a good word to use here, that he can't get the sword out after he stabs him with it. And again, the description of the blade being a blade on both sides is essentially one of, like, maybe again, when he pulls off the top of what would have been essentially like the hilt. I mean, like maybe he pulls out and there's a dagger on both sides. I mean, that's what it says. There's a blade on both sides, so that what you think he's just going to pull off, pull out, like you wouldn't normally pull out a sword, and there's a blade on both sides. So the blade is maybe on one side facing him, but it really goes right into him. And so he stabs the guy, can't even take out the blade. And I said it's pretty disgusting. The fact that from his wound, his intestines spill forth bile. And so when it says the dirt came out, they're literally saying that instead of going to the bathroom, it comes out of his stomach. I will say this is perhaps the most disgusting scene in the Bible, in all the Bible. I mean, the whole thing is disgusting. There's no question. It's probably the most violent, brutal, and physically nauseating scene in the Bible. I think it's safe to say, actually. So what we see here is that a guy is stabbed in a private situation. He's literally coaxed into having a private moment with Ehud, and Ehud assassinates him. I mean, this is an assassination. There is no other word for this other than assassination.
Then Ehud went out to the vestibule and shut the doors of the chamber upon him and locked them. When he was gone out, his servants came, and when they saw that, behold, the doors of the chamber were locked, they said, surely he is relieving himself in the cool chamber.
Yeah, and again, relieving himself means going to the bathroom, right? And there it is clearly, they think he's going to the bathroom. Which, by the way, the word that they use here in Hebrew really is that he's urinating rather than doing number two. I will say that. Mesichu et raglav means essentially like, honestly, what that phrase means is draining his leg, which generally speaking would be just urinating. But that is the word that they used for what his servants think is happening up there in the cool chamber.
And they waited till it was late, and behold, he opened not the doors of the chamber. Therefore they took a key and opened them. And behold, their Lord was fallen down dead on the earth. And Ehud escaped while they tarried, and passed beyond the carved stones, and escaped into Seir.
Yeah, so because he was locked in the bathroom and they didn't want to disturb their king, in the intervening in the time that had passed, Ehud was able to get out of the building. And he got all the way to Seir by the time they realized what had happened. So he fled out into the mountains while they're figuring out what happened. They open up the door. There he is, dead on the ground. Oh, wait, hold on. Before we go, again, everybody sees what happens here. They open up the door. They open it up, which by the way, you don't disturb the king when he's on the throne, even again, especially maybe on that throne. And again, the word kiseh is the same word for throne and for chair and for toilet. It's all the same word. So it's a play on the word. It's unknown what's really going on here until they open it up and see that he's dead on the toilet. The whole scene is pretty wild. And the fact that Ehud,
so Rabbi, it's kind of like Elvis then, huh?
it is an Elvis-like story in that you do not want to find someone dead in the bathroom. Hey, listen, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in the bathroom. It is definitely.
And remember, Elvis was the king.
Yes, he was a king. Yes, thank you, Mike, for the
Anytime.
king. And he also, by the way, fairly heavy at the time too, right? So all of these things are Elvis-like in a way. But I will tell you that the story is definitely a humiliation. Let's put it that way. And again, you do not want to be found dead in the bathroom. I think generally, I don't think any of us want to be found dead in the toilet. So the story has made its way through history now. Eglon, the huge king who got stabbed in the toilet. Not a great story, folks, but he is one of our heroes. Ehud, keep going.
And it came to pass when he arrived that he blew a shofar in the mount of Ephraim, and the children of Israel went down with him from the mount, and he before them. And he said to them, follow after me, for the Lord has delivered your enemies, namely Moab, into your hand. And they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan towards Moab, and allowed no man to pass over. And they slew of Moab at that time about 10,000 men, all lusty, and all men of valor, and no man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was quiet for 80 years.
Wow. That's twice as long as Othniel. And not only that, again, they didn't just kill one guy, they killed 10,000, about 10,000. All lusty men. I don't know if lusty is necessarily the translation that I would use, but the word shaman in Hebrew, which is shaman, is healthy. I would say healthy or radiating. They're ish chayil. They're men of valor. These are strong guys, and they killed them all. They killed, or didn't kill every Moabite, but they killed 10,000 Moabites. And it allowed the Moabites to not give them problems for 80 years. That's a long time for them to be quiet. All of this would add up to now, so far, we're at 120 years, essentially, since Joshua died. And not only 120 years, but 120 years of calm, not including the years of bad parts. So we're at least 120 years already now by this point. Let's keep going. We'll read a little bit more, and that's where we're going to wrap up at this verse, because we're not going to get into Deborah today, though I'm going to show you what we're going to read, but let's just read the last thing.
So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was quiet for 80 years. And after him was Shamgar, the son of Anat, who slew of the Philistines 600 men with an ox goad, and he also delivered Israel.
Yeah, now Shamgar we don't really know a lot about. We know that he is the son of Anat, which usually is a woman's name, but here it clearly, well, it doesn't say clearly, but he's the son of either Anat is a man or a woman, but we don't know, and that's all we know, and that he killed 600 guys with an ox goad. I mean, that's not quite Samson-like, but it's pretty close. Kills a lot of people with an ox goad. That's not even, that's not even that's not a weapon. That's something you stick an ox with, right? And so this guy Shamgar, don't know a lot about him. He was also a judge or a guy from this time. He is a judge. I mean, we give him credit for being a judge, and he fights against the Philistines. So far we fought against Aramite. We've Syria. We fought against the Moabites, and we fought against the Philistines a little bit, who are on the coast. So these are the first three guys that we read about. We read Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. And again, we don't know how many Israelites are involved in these campaigns, whether it's just the Israelites that are like the neighbors of those people, like the Judahites are neighbors of the Philistines on some level, the Moabites and Edomites on the south. But it's not just the people, clearly, because the Judites, Othniel fought against Aram, which is in the north, or Benjamin didn't have to necessarily, a Benjaminite like Ehud didn't necessarily have to fight against the Moabites. So it seems like there are cross tribal affiliations here, and the tribes are fighting to some extent together. We don't really know. It just says Israel, and so it doesn't say this tribe or that tribe. It says where the person is from. Though Shamgar is, he's the first guy we don't know what tribe he was from. We know Judah is from Othniel is from Judah, and we know that that Ehud is from Benjamin, but we don't know where Shamgar is from. But we do know that these tribes people maybe fought with other tribes, not just their own tribe, but they're leading probably other Israelites from other tribes as well. It doesn't say yet. We will get some descriptions of tribals, where this tribe is fighting, etc., but not yet. Now, this is chapter 3. Chapter 4 begins with the word, children of Israel did again what was in the sight, evil in the sight of the Lord when Ehud died. And now we're going to get into a battle with the Canaanites themselves, the actual people that you'd think we'd be fighting against, which are the people who are in our midst, not the Moabites, not the Aramites that are Arameans that are in separate areas, but literally like the Canaanites. This next battle we will, and this is the story of Deborah. So we're not going to read Deborah today. We're going to read Deborah next week. Please be here next week when we read Deborah, because it is, if not the high point or greatest part of Judges, it's one of the greatest parts of the Bible. There's so many things going on in the story of in Deborah, but it is definitely one of the highlights of Judges. It is also a great story, obviously, of women in the Bible. It's one of the clearest indications that women are leaders and are warriors and are, are prophets. I mean, that have that ability. Those are all things that you need to see, but it's also very interesting to see what happens in that story. There's definitely complex elements for people who've not read the story before or aren't really familiar with Deborah, or even if you're familiar with Deborah, you probably are going to see things in the story that you did not notice before. So please be here next week when we read chapters 4 and 5, which is the story of Deborah. And Ehud, interestingly, even though he's an assassin, is a murderer, was not a real popular name, even though he's a hero. So he's an assassin, but he's also a hero. Ehud was not a very popular name amongst Jewish people, maybe because he's more of a fighter as an assassin. He's not. We don't really know anything else about him other than that. He led the people in battle. But in modern Israel, Ehud is a very popular Hebrew name because of his military fighting. And you're going to see other guys in Judges that become heroes, and where we don't have a lot of Samsons. Samson is not a very popular name. It is a little bit more popular in modern Israel, and some of these other names are too. Shamgar still has not become a very popular name, and Othniel is not super popular, though you will see some Othniels in modern Israel, but you never saw people with those names in Jewish tradition. Like, most of us don't have grandparents that were named Othniel or Ehud or Shimshon, Samson. Those names from the books of Judges, most of those judges didn't have names that we use. Deborah, interestingly, was a name used throughout Jewish history. Again, there's not a lot of women names that are mentioned in the Bible. Deborah being, one of the names that, we would see throughout Jewish history. We'd see people that were named Deborah. Again, kind of keep that in mind when we read the book of Judges. You'll see people that are heroes, but tragic heroes in some cases, and in other cases, because they're military heroes, and Israel didn't want to, Jews didn't want to focus on those until modern day Israel. We didn't use a lot of those names. So everybody, we are going to wrap up and bid you adieu and have a great first week of November. Please have a safe and happy month as we go into this month also of Cheshvan. We're exiting Cheshvan the last couple of days. We're going to celebrate Rosh Chodesh, the new month, Thursday night. And the This month of Kislev that we're going into is the month of Hanukkah, which means, yes, as we talked about at the beginning, Hanukkah is only about 3.5 weeks away. Again, thank you, Rosemary, for reading, and it's good to have you back, Judith.
I just want to ask you a
Yes.
personal question. Have you seen the Alter translation of the Bible,
Yes.
Robert? How do you like it?
There are things I like about it. I don't love the Alter translation, so I don't use it a lot for teaching purposes. There are definitely things that I like about it, but it needs to be explained. Like some of the reasons why he translates the things that he does, they're interesting. And Robert Alter was professor of Bible at Berkeley for a very long time. He's very well respected. There are things that I think he's contributed. There's other things that I think he's made murkier. But it's not that he's opposed to Friedman, Richard Friedman, was my main professor of Bible, but they're definitely different approaches to things. I like Friedman's approach to things, which are try to really understand what it is and what it meant. Not that Alter doesn't do that, but I think sometimes he's being too clever, and I think Friedman isn't really trying to be clever. Friedman's really trying to get to the root of why. I think Friedman's more honest about humans and why they write the way they write. And that's what I like about Friedman, is that he just, I think he has a better judgment on people and why they would have written the things that they did when they wrote the Bible. And there aren't a lot of people who've done that with the Bible. I mean, I know him well enough. And again, he hasn't been my teacher for 30 years, but the thing I liked about Friedman is that he just understood people better, and he understood why people would have written the Bible the way they wrote it. And I think that you have to bring that to bear when you're studying the Bible and you're commenting on the Bible. It's not just a book of poetry or of narration or propaganda and all those other things. It's a book by people, and you really have to think about why the people wrote what they wrote. And I think if you don't take that into consideration, some of the other stuff is it's not that it's not important. It's just, I don't know that it might not really be as relevant. And I think you're actually skipping a step, which is people write the way they write because they're people. They don't write because they're not outside of their society. They're not outside of themselves. People write because they're human beings. And that I think is really important. Same reason we write music. I mean, there's not too much poetry we write today. You know that. We write music today. That is our poetry. I mean, there are American poets. I don't want to say they're not American poets, but we don't write. We have essayists. We have people who write great things of importance now, but we don't write the way we write the way we write, and to expect there to be someone like Mark Twain to write today or somebody, it's just not going to happen. We're not going to have a Nathaniel Hawthorne type writer writing in America today. But that's why Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize. Remember that. Nobel Prizes are given to essentially to people who write, what people feel. And we gave we didn't. The Nobel Prize committee gave it to Bob Dylan as an American poet. So I don't know. To me, you have to have that approach to literature and to writing to really think about people rather than just nobody writes for a professor. Nobody writes so that a professor will evaluate you and talk about you. You write because you write from your heart. So keep that in mind. Again, when you read stuff about people analyzing why other people write the way they write, they're not professors. I write, or you write, or whoever writes the way that comes from their heart. So, all right, everybody, take care. We'll see you soon.
Good week, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great week. Bye-bye, everybody.